Berlin, July 21st, 1944, shortly after midnight. In the courtyard of the Bendlerblock, the headquarters of the German Army's Reserve Command in the center of Berlin, 4 men are standing against a makeshift execution wall, illuminated by the headlights of military vehicles. They have been convicted of treason against the German Reich in a summary proceeding that lasted minutes rather than hours, conducted by men who understood that speed was essential, that the longer these men remained alive, the more questions would accumulate about what had happened in the preceding 24 hours. The first to be shot is General Friedrich Olbricht, who has spent years in the conspiracy against Hitler, who managed the organizational infrastructure that made the assassination attempt possible. Then General Ludwig Beck, who attempted to shoot himself before the execution and failed, surviving to be finished by a sergeant's pistol. Then Werner von Haeften, aide and companion to the man at the center of everything that has happened today. And then, last, the man whose name history will attach to this entire operation, this entire day, this entire attempt to end the 12 years of catastrophe that the Nazi regime has inflicted on Germany and on Europe. Colonel Claus Philipp Maria Schenk, Graf von Stauffenberg, is 36 years old. He is missing his right hand and 2 fingers of his left hand, lost in Tunisia in 1943. He has 1 functioning eye. He is, despite these physical diminishments, one of the most capable staff officers in the German military, and he is the man who carried the bomb into the Wolf's Lair on the afternoon of July 20th, 1944, and placed it under the conference table where Adolf Hitler was standing. Hitler survived. Stauffenberg did not know this when he flew back to Berlin and threw himself into the organizational work of activating Operation Valkyrie, the contingency plan that was supposed to mobilize the Reserve Army to seize control of the German government in the hours following Hitler's death. He did not know it until the communications from Rastenburg made clear that the bomb had detonated, that the conference room had been destroyed, and that Hitler was alive. By then it was too late. In the courtyard of the Bendlerblock, in the beam of the vehicle headlights, Stauffenberg is shot. His last words, documented by witnesses present, are a declaration, "Long live sacred Germany." He dies at approximately 12:30 in the morning of July 21st, 1944. This is his story. It is the story of how a German officer of aristocratic background, who had initially welcomed the national revival that Hitler's movement seemed to offer, came to place a bomb under the conference table of the man he had once served, and of what that act cost him and the hundreds of people connected to him by the threads of the conspiracy he led. It is a story about moral transformation, about the specific process by which a person moves from complicity to resistance, about what it takes to act against a totalitarian system from inside it, and about the costs that such action carries when it fails. Claus von Stauffenberg was born on November 15, 1907, in Jettingen, Bavaria, into one of the most distinguished aristocratic families in southern Germany. The Stauffenberg family's roots in the German Catholic nobility went back centuries, their tradition shaped by the specific combination of military service, religious commitment, and cultural cultivation that characterized the best of the German aristocratic heritage. His father was the Oberhofmarschall, the senior court official of the last king of Württemberg. His mother was a countess in her own right, descended from the great Prussian military reformer Gneisenau. The household in which the 3 Stauffenberg brothers, twins Berthold and Alexander, and the younger Claus, grew up was one of serious intellectual and spiritual formation. Their education was guided in part by the circle of the poet Stephan George, whose aesthetic philosophy of spiritual aristocracy and national renewal shaped the intellectual formation of many young Germans of cultivated background in the Weimar period. The George Circle's vision of Germany's spiritual destiny, its celebration of heroic individual commitment to transcendent values, left a permanent imprint on Stauffenberg's thinking and on the moral framework within which he would eventually make his most consequential decisions. He chose a military career, entering the Bamberg Cavalry Regiment in 1926 and pursuing the professional military education that the Reichswehr, the small professional army of the Weimar Republic, provided for its officers. He was a gifted staff officer, combining the intellectual abilities that his education had developed with the practical military competence that his training provided, and his career trajectory suggested someone who would rise to senior command. His initial response to the Nazi movement's rise to power in 1933 was more complex than simple enthusiasm, but it was not rejection. The specific combination of national renewal, restoration of German military strength, and apparent reversal of the humiliations of Versailles that the Nazi program offered appealed to dimensions of his political and patriotic sensibility, even as other aspects of the movement's character, its vulgarity, its anti-Semitism, its contempt for the aristocratic and Christian values he held, were things he found repellent. This ambivalence in the early years of the Nazi regime was not unusual among German military officers of his background and generation. The Wehrmacht as an institution had its own relationship with the Nazi state, a relationship of institutional cooperation with the dominant political force that provided the resources and the national context for military rebuilding, combined with the professional military culture's view of itself as serving Germany rather than any particular political party. Stauffenberg's progression through the 1930s involved increasingly senior staff positions, the development of his operational and planning abilities, and the accumulation of experience across the various theaters and challenges of the expanding German military establishment. He was at the War Academy in Berlin in the mid-1930s, serving in senior staff roles through the late 1930s, part of the professional military establishment that was managing the Wehrmacht's transformation into the instrument of conquest that the Nazi state required. His direct encounter with the realities of Nazi racial policy in the East, specifically his observation of what the German military and the SS were doing in the occupied Soviet territories following the June 1941 invasion, was among the most significant experiences in the development of his opposition to the regime. The systematic murder of Jews, the treatment of Soviet prisoners of war, the implementation of the criminal orders that characterized German operations in the East, all of these were things that he encountered directly and that forced a confrontation with what the regime he was serving actually was. The documented accounts of his reactions to what he witnessed in the East, from people who were with him and who subsequently testified about his responses, describe a man who was increasingly and explicitly disturbed by what he was observing, who made statements about the criminality of what was being done, who was moving from the ambivalence of his earlier position toward a more explicit moral rejection of the regime's conduct. His wounding in Tunisia in April 1943 was physically devastating and operationally transformative. A British aircraft attacked the vehicle he was traveling in, leaving him with wounds that cost him his right hand, the fourth and fifth fingers of his left hand, and his left eye. He spent months recovering from these wounds at a Munich hospital, and the period of recovery was, by the accounts of people who visited him, and by his own subsequent statements and letters, a period of deepened moral and spiritual reflection. He had already been in contact with elements of the German resistance before his wounding in Tunisia, through the networks of military and civilian opposition to Hitler that had been developing since the late 1930s. The German resistance to Hitler, the Widerstand, was a complex and diverse phenomenon that included military officers, conservative politicians, trade unionists, religious figures, and others whose opposition to the Nazi regime was rooted in different values and different specific objections. What united them was the conviction that Hitler's Germany was catastrophically wrong, and that resistance was morally required. Stauffenberg's engagement with the resistance deepened after his return to active duty in late 1943, when he was assigned as Chief of Staff to General Friedrich Olbricht at the Army Reserve Command in Berlin. This position was the operational key to everything that followed. The Reserve Army, the home army that trained and supplied replacement troops for the front, was the military formation that was supposed to maintain order within Germany in case of internal emergency. Its command structure was one of the most significant concentrations of military force within Germany itself, and the contingency plan that governed its activation in emergency conditions was the instrument that the conspirators intended to use to seize control of the German government. Operation Valkyrie was an existing Wehrmacht contingency plan for mobilizing the reserve army in the event of internal unrest, originally conceived as a response to the possibility of revolt by the millions of foreign forced laborers in Germany. Stauffenberg and his co-conspirators recognized that this plan, with modifications, could serve as the operational framework for a military takeover following Hitler's assassination. They worked within their official roles to revise the Valkyrie orders in ways that would direct the reserve army to seize key government buildings and communication centers and arrest SS and Nazi party officials. The modification of Valkyrie for the conspirators' purposes was conducted as part of legitimate staff work. The changes embedded in official military planning documents that had been reviewed and approved through normal channels without the reviewing officers understanding the real purpose for which they had been modified. This was the specific operational genius of the approach. Using the existing military command structure and its legitimate planning processes to create the instrument of the coup without triggering the security apparatus's detection. The civilian component of the conspiracy had developed plans for a post-Hitler government, with figures including Ludwig Beck as proposed head of state, Karl Goerdeler as proposed chancellor, and other conservative and social democratic figures filling various governmental roles. The specific political character of the proposed post-coup government was conservative and nationalist, rather than democratic in any fully developed sense, reflecting the political backgrounds and values of the resistance's core participants, but it represented a genuine alternative to the Nazi state and an intention to negotiate a peace that the Nazi leadership would never accept. The challenge that the conspirators faced through 1943 and into 1944 was finding a reliable opportunity to kill Hitler. Multiple earlier attempts had failed for various reasons. Bombs that did not detonate, last-minute changes in Hitler's schedule that prevented access, the collapse of plans before they could be implemented. The operational difficulties of killing a man whose security arrangements were comprehensive and constantly varied, who rarely appeared in predictable locations at predictable times, and whose inner circle was heavily penetrated by the security apparatus, were genuine and had defeated multiple previous attempts. Stauffenberg's appointment in June 1944 as Chief of Staff to Colonel General Friedrich Fromm, the commander of the Reserve Army, gave him the access that previous assassins had lacked. His new position required him to attend briefings at Hitler's various headquarters, bringing him into direct personal contact with Hitler on multiple occasions and giving him both the access and the legitimate reason for presence that an assassination attempt required. The selection of Stauffenberg as the assassin was not without operational complications. He was missing a hand and 2 fingers, had only 1 functioning eye, and would be required to arm a bomb using unfamiliar equipment under time pressure, in a bathroom adjacent to the briefing room, with a limited window of privacy. The physical challenges of the operation were real and were understood by the conspirators, who worked with Stauffenberg on the specific techniques required. The bomb mechanism used was a British-made time delay fuse, obtained through SOE contacts and tested by the conspirators for its operational characteristics. The fuse was activated by crushing a small glass capsule containing acid, which then ate through a wire that held back the firing pin. The time between activation and detonation depended on the temperature and on the specific fuse, typically 10 to 15 minutes at normal temperatures. The events of July 20th, 1944, began with Stauffenberg's early morning flight from Berlin to the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's military headquarters in the forests of East Prussia near Rastenburg. He was accompanied by his aide, Werner von Haeften, who carried the second bomb that was supposed to supplement the first. They arrived at the Wolf's Lair complex in the late morning, attended a preliminary meeting, and then, shortly before the noon briefing at which Hitler would be present, Stauffenberg excused himself to change his shirt in an anteroom adjacent to the briefing facility. In the anteroom, with Haften's assistance and using the special pliers that had been prepared for his limited hands, Stauffenberg armed the fuse of the first bomb. He did not arm the second bomb, interrupted by an adjutant who came to tell him that the briefing was about to begin. The decision to proceed with only 1 bomb rather than 2 reduced the explosive force of the device by half, a reduction that would prove operationally significant. The briefing was held not in the concrete bunker that would normally have been used for such meetings, but in an above-ground wooden barrack building, a change made because of the summer heat. This seemingly minor detail had significant consequences. A concrete bunker would have contained the blast and concentrated its force. The wooden building allowed the explosion to dissipate more widely, reducing the lethal effect on anyone not immediately adjacent to the bomb. Stauffenberg placed his briefcase, containing the armed bomb, under the heavy oak conference table near where Hitler was standing, as close to Hitler's position as he could manage. He then excused himself from the room on the pretext of needing to make a telephone call, moved away from the building, and waited. At approximately 12:42, the bomb detonated. The explosion was massive by any normal measure. The briefing room was destroyed. Windows were blown out across the complex. Several people were killed or mortally wounded. The aftermath looked like the aftermath of a catastrophic detonation. But Hitler survived. He was standing at the table when the bomb went off, but at the moment of detonation, another officer had moved the briefcase from its original position, sliding it to the other side of one of the table's heavy oak support legs. This movement of the briefcase, which occurred without any awareness of what it contained, placed the thick oak leg between the bomb and Hitler at the critical moment, deflecting a significant portion of the blast away from him. Hitler suffered ruptured eardrums, burns, and temporary hearing damage, but he was alive and conscious within minutes of the explosion. Stauffenberg, watching from several hundred meters away, saw the explosion and heard the detonation, and believed, as did others watching from a distance, that no one in the room could have survived. He had to get out of the Wolf's Lair and back to Berlin to direct the activation of Valkyrie. He and Haften drove toward the airfield, passed through the outer security checkpoints by a combination of confidence and the continued confusion in the immediate aftermath of the explosion, reached the aircraft, and took off for Berlin. During the approximately 3-hour flight back to Berlin, Stauffenberg did not know that Hitler had survived. He believed the assassination had succeeded. He was flying toward Berlin to coordinate the coup that was supposed to follow the dictator's death. The conspirators in Berlin, centered at the Bendlerblock, were waiting for the confirmation of Hitler's death that would allow them to activate Valkyrie and begin the operation that would take control of the German government. The uncertainty about Hitler's fate in the hours following the explosion was the critical failure point of the entire operation. Reports were reaching Berlin from the Wolf's Lair that indicated Hitler had survived, but the conspirators were uncertain whether these reports were accurate or were Nazi disinformation designed to paralyze the coup attempt. The hours of July 20th from early afternoon through the evening were hours of confusion, failed communications, missed opportunities, and the progressive collapse of the conspiracy's operational cohesion. The Valkyrie orders were eventually transmitted, too late and too uncertainly, and the responses from various military commanders around Germany and occupied Europe reflected the specific problem of an operation that required swift, decisive action and received instead hesitation and mixed signals. The key failure of the communications management was the inability of the conspirators to cut off the Wolf's Lair's telephone communications with Berlin in the critical hours following the explosion. Hitler's communications with his senior officers in Berlin, including conversations that made clear he was alive, began early and were not interrupted. The commanders to whom the conspirators were appealing for support received conflicting signals. Valkyrie orders from the Bendlerblock and direct communications from a living Hitler. In Paris, where the military commander General Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel activated the conspiracy's plans with decisive energy, arresting thousands of SS and SD personnel in the French capital, the operation demonstrated what the conspiracy could accomplish when decisively implemented. But Paris was an exception. Across most of the German military command structure, the response was paralysis, awaiting clarification, refusing to commit to an operation whose central premise, Hitler's death, appeared to be contradicted by communications from the Wolf's Lair. Stauffenberg arrived at the Bendlerblock in the late afternoon and threw himself into the operational management of the coup attempt with the energy of someone who still believed the operation had succeeded. He worked the telephones, argued with hesitant commanders, pushed for the decisive action that the situation required. His certainty that Hitler was dead, based on what he had seen and heard at the Wolf's Lair, was genuine and remained genuine for hours after the reports of Hitler's survival began to circulate. By evening it was over. The military commanders who had been wavering made their decisions in favor of continued loyalty to Hitler. The Bendlerblock itself was the scene of a counter-coup by officers loyal to Hitler, who arrested Stauffenberg, Olbricht, and the other conspirators in the building. General Fromm, the reserve army commander who had been aware of the conspiracy without being an active participant, now moved decisively to distance himself from it, ordering the arrest and immediate execution of the conspirators under his command. The summary executions in the Bendlerblock courtyard in the early hours of July 21st were Fromm's attempt to eliminate witnesses to his own knowledge of the conspiracy before the Gestapo investigation could establish how much he had known. It did not save him. He was subsequently arrested, tried, and executed in March 1945 for his failure to report the conspiracy earlier. Stauffenberg died in the courtyard of the Bendlerblock, shot by firing squad at approximately 12:30 in the morning of July 21st, 1944. The arrests that followed in the days and weeks after July 20th were comprehensive and conducted with the thoroughness of an apparatus that understood the conspiracy had been extensive and that spared no effort to identify everyone connected to it. The Gestapo investigation, directed personally by Heinrich Himmler, who was appointed by Hitler to oversee it, used the arrest of conspirators as the foundation for extracting information about the full network of the resistance. The People's Court trials that followed were presided over by Roland Freisler, the court's president, whose conduct of the proceedings was marked by the theatrical humiliation of defendants, the screaming denunciations, the specific cruelty of a proceeding designed not to determine guilt, which was assumed, but to degrade the defendants publicly before their inevitable executions. The trials were filmed by order of Hitler, who wanted to watch the proceedings. The films survive and have been analyzed by historians as documents of both the resistance and the Nazi judicial system's operation. The defendants who appeared before Freisler's court were given no genuine opportunity to present evidence or legal argument. They were subjected to sustained verbal abuse from the judge, required to stand without belts or suspenders holding up their clothes, in some cases in ill-fitting civilian clothes rather than uniforms. The physical indignities calculated to undermine the dignity of men whose military bearing and aristocratic backgrounds made their degradation a specific ideological statement. The sentences were death, delivered with a speed that the urgency of silencing the network required. The executions of the conspirators were conducted at Plötzensee prison in Berlin, where a specific form of execution was used that had been ordered by Hitler after he watched the initial courtroom footage. Hanging from meat hooks by piano wire, a form of death designed to be slow and painful. The agony of the condemned documented on film for Hitler's subsequent viewing. The execution of the July 20th conspirators was among the most deliberately cruel in the history of German political justice, designed to punish not just the individuals, but the tradition they represented, the German military aristocracy whose values had produced the resistance. The scope of the reprisals extended far beyond the direct participants. The Gestapo's principle of Sippenhaft, collective family responsibility, meant that the families of the conspirators were also arrested. Wives, parents, siblings, and children were taken into custody, sent to concentration camps, separated from each other, their fates managed as part of the punishment of the conspirators through the people they loved. Nina von Stauffenberg, pregnant with the couple's fifth child at the time of the assassination attempt, was arrested and sent to a concentration camp, where she gave birth under custody. She survived the war. The children of the conspirators were in some cases removed from their families and given new names and new identities in the Nazi state's care, a specific form of the collective punishment that reflected the regime's determination to erase not just the individuals, but their family lines from the German national narrative. Most of the children were eventually reunited with surviving family members after Germany's defeat in May 1945. The total number of people executed in connection with the July 20th plot is estimated at approximately 200, with thousands more arrested and imprisoned. The network of the German resistance, which had been building across years and which represented the most significant organized German opposition to Hitler within Germany, was essentially destroyed by the arrests and executions of the second half of 1944 and the first months of 1945. The historical assessment of the July 20th conspirators and their attempt has evolved considerably across the 8 decades since the event. In the immediate post-war period, the conspirators were not universally celebrated in West Germany. The specific question of whether officers who had served the Nazi state and participated in its wars had the moral standing to claim the role of resistance heroes was one that German society worked through across years of public discussion. The complexity of individual biographies within the conspiracy, the fact that many of the conspirators had served the Nazi state competently and loyally before their opposition developed, that some had participated in or observed criminal operations in the East without immediately resisting them, that the resistance's political vision was conservative and nationalist rather than democratic in any fully developed modern sense. All of these complexities resisted the simple heroic narrative that the post-war period's political needs might have preferred. Stauffenberg's own biography reflects these complexities. His initial response to the Nazi movement was not straightforward rejection. His development toward resistance was a process that took years and that was shaped by specific experiences: the encounter with the criminality of German operations in the East, the deepening understanding of where Hitler's war was leading, the specific moral framework provided by his Catholic faith, and the intellectual formation of the Stefan George Circle. What is not complex is the act itself. Placing a bomb under the conference table of a totalitarian dictator, accepting the personal risk that the operation required, proceeding despite the earlier failures and the technical difficulties imposed by his physical wounds, flying back to Berlin to direct the coup attempt in the face of uncertainty about its success. These were acts of genuine moral courage, conducted at full awareness of the cost of failure. He knew what the cost of failure was. He had been in the resistance long enough to know what happened to people who were caught. He proceeded anyway. The moral weight of July 20th, 1944, the weight that has made it the central reference point for discussions of resistance to totalitarianism, is the weight of people who understood the cost of acting and acted anyway, not because they were certain of success, but because they believed that acting was morally required regardless of the odds. The conspiracy failed. Hitler survived for another 9 months, and the war continued for 9 more months, killing hundreds of thousands more people. The specific calculation of whether earlier success would have ended the war sooner, how many lives might have been saved, how the specific political and military situation would have developed under a post-Hitler German government trying to negotiate peace with the Allies, is one that historians have explored extensively without reaching conclusions that could be stated with confidence. What can be stated is that the people of July 20th knew these uncertainties and proceeded despite them, that their moral assessment of the situation was that acting was better than not acting, that the attempt was required by what they knew and what they believed regardless of what it might cost them. It cost most of them their lives. Stauffenberg was shot in the courtyard of the Bendlerblock in the beam of headlights on the early morning of July 21st, 1944. His last words were, "Long live sacred Germany." He was 36 years old. The Germany he died for, the Germany of his imagination and his values, the Germany that transcended the Nazi state and that he believed was worth dying to restore, did not exist in the form he envisioned. It has never entirely existed. But the gesture toward it, the act of placing himself against the machinery of the totalitarian state at the cost of everything he had, is part of the German historical record in ways that complicate any simple narrative about what Germans did and did not do during the years of the Nazi regime. He tried, he failed, he paid the price, and the act of trying in the specific circumstances of July 20th 1944, with the full knowledge of what failure would cost and the full acceptance of that cost, is the thing that history has not forgotten and is unlikely to forget. The totalitarian state can be resisted. The resistance may fail. The cost of failure may be everything. But the act of resistance, the moral assertion that the regime does not have the last word about what is right and what is possible, is not nothing. It is, in the end, the thing that matters most in the long accounting of what human beings do when the systems they live in require them to choose between complicity and conscience. Stauffenberg chose conscience. He paid for it in the courtyard of the Bendlerblock, in the dark, in the early morning hours of July 21st, 1944. And the world has not forgotten.